from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we bring you a story of, I believe, the most courageous person that I have met in my life. Our guest is Alicia Appelman-Uhrman. Many of you have probably heard about her wonderful book. It is entitled Alicia, My Story, and one of our tasks today is to go through this and talk about one of the great tragedies of human history. Our guest and her family were in Poland when there was the Holocaust that took place in Poland and in Germany, and she has told this powerful story in this book called Alicia, My Story. I think I can introduce this program with the most emphasis by quoting from, first of all, the book itself, or Bantam Books, as they described this work. They said, "Not since the diary of Anne Frank has a young voice so vividly and poignantly expressed the potential for humanity and heroism in the face of Nazi brutality, as does Alicia Uhrman in her autobiography, A Young Girl's Story of Courage and Honor in a World Ravaged by War." If I may just go a little bit further, I would like to read the first passage in chapter 1 from her book, which I believe illustrates very much the tragedy and also the power of this work and what we must try to avoid in the future. Our guest starts out in the first paragraph by saying, "First they kill my brother Moshe, then they kill my father, then they kill my brother Bruno, then they kill my brother Zachary, then they kill my last brother Herzl. Only my mother and I were left. I vowed that I would never let them kill her, that I would protect my mother from the Nazis and their collaborations for as long as I lived." And the further tragedy of the story is that her mother did die. But fortunately, our guest survived, and she has spent her life in this work, and she has represented their silence with the most powerful story. And I want to say to our guest, we are so honored that you would take time to be with us and tell this very powerful story. And most of all, we want to thank you for having the courage and the determination to tell the story. And I will say to our viewers that you spoke yesterday to 1,300 people, many of them high school students, and you have a power that is remarkable in sharing your story of what humanity should be like. And thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Danny. Good afternoon.
And as always, I'm so pleased to have Steve Schenck, who is our panel member and is the Dean of College Relations and Development at Idaho College, and he shall commence today's questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Alicia, I've read your book, and I've had the privilege of hearing you speak, so I know that even though we're going to bring you back next week, there's no way that we can cover in those two shows everything that the book has to say to people. So I think it's important that I start my question by giving you the opportunity to tell us more about the book. So I would ask you, how is it that you came to write it? Why and for whom?
I came to the United States in 1952, and in 1953 I started telling my story. I swore on my brother's grave, on Zachary's grave, that if I lived, I will tell the world how bravely the teenagers, boys and girls, fought during the war, fought German tyranny, fought Ukrainian and Polish collaboration. And when I finish my presentation at schools, the students often ask me, "Alicia, could you write this story down so that our parents could read it?" And 29 years later, I finally had an opportunity to write this book from 1982 to 1983.
Let's move into some of the things that you've told. I opened the book with the tragedy, and we have many viewers of different ages, and let's talk about from a very personal perspective. And again, I want to commend you for the great courage that you have. Not only are you telling the story of your family, but you are representing everyone that was part of this horrendous evil that had taken on in Europe. Would you share with our viewers, first of all, some of the things that happened to your family?
Now, I'm representing over 1 million people who did not die in concentration camps. We were taken as soon as the Germans entered our hometown, and that was 1941. Even though the war started in 1939, Germany and Russia divided Poland, and Western Poland fell under the German occupation, and Eastern Poland fell under the Russian occupation. So I was under the Russian occupation 2 years. In 1941, when Germany broke the peace treaty with Russia, the Germans invaded us. They invaded Russia. At the beginning, we were in the home very short time. They brought us into a ghetto, into an open ghetto, they called it. They did not fence us in. They asked us to wear the Star of David embroidered with blue thread. They did not give us any food at all. To get food, we had to leave the ghetto, go to the market, and buy it there from the farmers. And of course, we children realized that if we would let our parents go out, they would be killed. So we children went out, and we were killed. And the children were extremely brave. And then the nightmare started. First, they took all men from 18 to 50, Jewish men, had to come to a registration, and then most of them they let go, but 600 leading citizens were detained and massacred into open graves. My father was one of them. And then the actions started. They called them Aktionen. They were done by Einsatzgruppen. The SS, Gestapo, with the collaboration of the Ukrainian and Polish police, surrounded the ghetto, and then they attacked each home. And they found the people in hiding places, took them to the forest, and massacred them into open graves.
Can we stop here and talk about with the tragedy of your father's death? Would you take us a little bit further when you did not know for sure what had happened, and then even after the tragedy, how they took advantage of you as a family in asking for ransom?
In 1967, the German consul in Los Angeles asked me to come to testify against one of the murders of the 600 men. And the German consul read back the statement to me and said the Germans, the SS men said that all 600 men were massacred into open graves the following day. But you see, 3 days after the registration, the Germans came to us and told us, you want to get your men back, you can ransom them. So they took everything from us. Of course, my mother gave everything she had to ransom my father. They lied to us, stole from us, and 600 families were left destitute. And this story was told by the SS man when he was accused. He told it exactly what happened.
Stevie, I'll let you continue the story.
And I'm going to go back to that early portion of your book. In that initial partition of Poland between the Soviet Union and Russia, it was the Russians then, I would guess, who forced you out of your home and into ghettos.
No, the Russians did not. The Russians didn't force us out of our homes. What the Russians did, however, they didn't let us go to Hebrew Academy, our Hebrew Academy, which I attended in the afternoon because during the day I went to a regular school, and this was Poland, was a Catholic school. What the Russians did, however, if your father was a businessman, they considered you an enemy of the Soviet Union, and they took the people out, those they considered enemy of Soviet Union businessmen. They took them in the middle of the night, the NKVD they came, put them on freight trains and exiled them to Siberia.
I see.
But they were not what you would call anti-Semitic. But we had a tragedy in our family because my brother Moshe went to study in a Russian school. He ran away from school, he was arrested, taken to prison, he died in prison. So our tragedy started already under the Russian occupation, 1939, 1940, 1941.
And I hate to jump around too much in the book.
Just go right ahead.
Much later in the book, you talk about continued problems. Although you were oftentimes befriended by Russians, you were also betrayed by Russians. Was that a pattern that continued throughout the war?
What happened when the Germans occupied us? We were occupied until the spring of 1944, and of course most of us were killed. The spring of 1944, the Russians reoccupied our area, our hometown, and my mother survived because I saved my mother and some other Jewish people. And we were free for a couple of months. But what happened? The Russians were in such a hurry to go west to meet up with the Americans. They surrounded 3 German divisions in the city of Tarnopol. These divisions broke through and reoccupied my hometown. At night, when they were returning to our hometown, we didn't know the Germans were coming back. My mother and I tried and escape, but my mother was hit by a piece of shrapnel. But you see, the Russians could have told us, because from Tarnopol to Buchach, there were about 30 kilometers, that the Germans are coming back and we would have escaped. But they didn't tell us. And I felt betrayed because my mother really didn't have to die at that time. We could have escaped.
Well, I'm going to jump way back in the other direction. Although, again, a theme that reappears throughout the book is the betrayal of you and your family by people who had been your neighbors, at least, and at least apparently your friends before the war. Going back even before the non-aggression pact between Russia and Germany, what was life like for you? I mean, was the Jewish population in Poland where you lived, were they threatened at all by the other local people? Or was the relationship good?
As far as I remembered as a child, and I must speak from that point of view, and there was anti-Semitism, which our family experienced, because my brother Zachary was a student at the Conservatory of Music. He was a violinist. In the spring of 1938, he was very badly beaten by 5 Polish students called Indiki, and they destroyed his violin. So when he came home in the spring of 1938, and they beat him up only because he was a Jewish boy. So I realized, even though I lived beautifully with our neighbors and everything, there was rampant anti-Semitism in Poland. And that's when I had the taste of pain because of my brother.
We've already talked today on the program about what happened to your father, and also in talking about the Germans re-entering your town, the death of your mother, and also the death of one of your brothers while in a prison while the Russians were there. Can you also share with our viewers, and we're going to move into some more areas that you can communicate some other issues, but you had 2 other brothers that also lost their life during the occupation.
Yes, my brother Zachary was 17 years old when he and his friends organized a resistance called Nekama. That means revenge. You see, there were farmers who took Jewish families, but they kept them a little while. They took everything from them. They told them they're taking them to a safe place, and they killed them themselves or brought them to the police, and the police killed them. And that was devastating, because if a German kills you, a German kills you, but your own neighbors. So my brother and his friends went to the farmer who betrayed or killed the family, burned his barn, beat the farmer up, but didn't kill because they were not killers. Sometimes my brother was missing from home half a day or day, but this time my brother was missing 3 days. And I went looking for him, and then in the 3rd day in the afternoon, I came across a group of 2 boys and 2 girls. And as I was approaching them, I heard the girl say, "Here comes his little sister, here comes his little sister." And I picked up, I said, "What about the little sister?" And one boy stepped forward and said, "Alicia, I will take you to your brother." We crossed the bridge, we came to the prison yard, and there was my brother hanging. And he was betrayed by a Polish boy. He was trying to save a family with 4 children. And they caught him, they ambushed them, and they hung him.
And then you had...
And when we buried him, I swore on his grave that if I lived, I shall tell his story and the story of many brave boys and girls, the age of the children in Lake City, where I spoke today in high school. And I kept my promise. I literally dedicated my life to telling their story, to being their silenced voice.
And we commend you so much for doing that.
Thank you. You are very kind.
And it's very powerful, and it's a great lesson for the future in history. At this point, you had 1 brother left, and your mother.
I had still Bunyo, my brother Bunyo. The Germans came, and you see, I'm using the word the Germans, although in my book I use the word the Nazis. You see, I never heard the word Nazi. All during the Holocaust, I never heard the word Nazi. To me, there were German soldiers with guns and machine guns and dogs, and they declared war on us Jewish children. And this is all I knew. And so they came and they gathered many of the boys in the ghetto, and they caught my brother Bunyo. They took him to a war camp. And one of the boys tried to escape, and then they took out. All of the boys made a circle, and then they counted to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They shot every 10th boy. My brother Bunyo was the 10th boy. And I had to tell my mother. It was devastating. This is how I lost most of my family. Only my mother, my little brother, Herzl, remained.
One thing we talked about before the program, and you certainly made a point in your speech at our campus yesterday, oftentimes when we read history of this terrible time, we think about the Nazi Party and Hitler, and it was just atrocious. And we think that they carried all this out without any support from any people outside of either Germany or the party. And we know that you experienced that's not true. And I wish you'd share that with us. And also, it is an opportunity for you to give a message to our viewers about how some individuals and groups will conspire with people that are so evil as the Nazi regime was.
I only know as a child, and I knew then, that the Germans could never have killed us all if it was not the collaboration of the Ukrainian and Polish police. Many of us tried to escape into the forests and the villages, and we were chopped to pieces right there. And I will just give you one example. When I organized an orphanage after the liberation, I had a little girl in the orphanage, about 14 years old. She had terrible nightmares. Every night she woke up screaming. And I finally cornered her. I say, now you are going to tell me what you're screaming about. They're all screaming, but your heart is breaking each time you wake up. So she told me this story. She was about 12, her little brother 10. They escaped through the sewers from the Warsaw Ghetto and tried to survive on the Aryan side. And she had left her little brother, 10-year-old, and she tried to get some food. When she came back, she saw a Paul holding her brother by the shirt. She followed. He took this little boy into the Gestapo headquarters. About half an hour later, he came out. He had a brown bag. He opened the bag, put his finger, and was licking. He got 2 pounds or 1 pound of sugar for bringing this Jewish boy to death. And this is what was torturing this little girl. Now, the Germans weren't even looking for this little boy. Was that pound of sugar so important? Was it worth the life of a little Jewish boy? And this was tormenting this little girl.
Also share with us, Alicia, that in Poland, experiences that you had and observed too, that in addition to the police that turned individuals in to the Nazis that were there, in the rural areas, some of the farmers first befriended the members of the Jewish community and then yet turned on them.
Well, they promised to hide them, and the people gave them all they had. And then after a while, they decided that they are not going to keep them and told them they are going to dig a safe place for them in the forest. And this I know firsthand because I know it from my brother. Instead of saving, they took them and shot them in the forest or brought them to the police, and the police killed them. And that's being betrayed, totally betrayed. I did not expect our Ukrainian or Polish neighbors to hide us or to save us. I would not ask them. I would not endanger them, and I wouldn't ask them. At least if they have just kept quiet and not collaborated. The tragedy was this collaboration. And for what? For a pair of shoes or for a shirt or for a house? What was our life worth?
Please extend this, as what you told me before the program too, as a lesson today, that if a dictatorial leader or group was to try to invade a country or place, how can one best prevent this by just what you're talking about?
When I speak to the students, I emphasize the importance of the loyalty of your neighbors. It's extremely important that you should know your neighbor. It's very important that the neighbor remains loyal to you. Let's say any force would invade the United States. Our survival is not going to be how we fight the force, but how we relate and care for each other. If our neighbors turn against, if one majority turns against one minority, the minority will never have a chance to survive, never. But if they stand by, together they can defeat the invading force. So loyalty of a neighbor is extremely important. It's more important than ammunition, it's more important than food, because this is how you are going to be able to survive if your neighbors help you, or at least don't betray you. And I talk to the children over and over again. I tell them, Shomer Achi Anochi, I am my brother's keeper, especially in the United States. You know, I told the children now, the French live in France, the Germans live in Germany, Italians in Italy, but everybody else lives in this country. People come to us from all over the world. And we have to live together, and we have to know how to respect each other, and we must never think that one is better than the other. We are all citizens. And most of all, we must aim that our government should make sure that every citizen is protected by the law. And if this happens, then we are all safe. But if any time the protection of the law is removed from any people, this is how the Holocaust starts.
Certainly the early history of this country, there were some slogans that support everything you're saying. We've heard such slogans as, united we stand, divided we fall. And that's a lesson you learned and saw personally.
Yes, I have learned to. This is why when people talk about my being Polish or anything, I say, yes, I was born in Poland, yes, my country was Poland, but my country betrayed me.
Steve Sheen.
Do you find it ironic, Alicia, and I hope I'm going to get this right, I think I have it right, that there was a point in Poland where the Ukrainians were also a minority in Poland. Is that correct?
Yes.
And didn't the Polish forces start to turn against some of the Ukrainian farmers in the area where you were hiding, and weren't they protected by Jewish and Russian partisans?
Okay, what happened is that after the Ukrainian helped, and mostly Ukrainians, not as many Poles, but Ukrainians helped the Germans kill the Jews, the Ukrainians turned against the Polish farmers, and they were burning Polish villages. And it was the Jewish partisans. I met there the whole group of the partisans my brother organized who were protecting the Polish villages. And I even met him and I say, Osho, I say, how can you go protect the Poles? Because at that time they had ammunition. And he made this kind of joke. He says, they feed us. But it is just the beauty of these young people, sanctity of life. Even I was amazed that they would, they didn't have to protect anybody because among these Poles could have been somebody who betrayed, but you see, this is what was so beautiful about these boys and girls, sanctity of life.
Yeah, you said earlier that your brother Zachary was one of the partisans and he was hanged. There's a wonderful story in the book about, I think you were searching for your father before you realized that he'd actually been killed. And didn't Zachary come looking for you in the forest? Could you tell us that story?
When after I heard that the 600 men were killed, I thought, my father was a graduate from military academy in Vienna. He was a cavalryman. He was decorated for heroism on the Russian front because he saved the staff of 38 German high-ranking officers from under the Cossacks' prison. And so I thought, being so brave, maybe he tried to escape. Maybe he, he was wounded. Maybe he was just waiting for me to fight. And so I went into the forest looking for him, calling his name. And then I fell asleep from exhaustion. And my brother Zachary found me, lifted me into his arm, and he says, Alicia, our father is not coming home.
Yeah, that's a very touching story, one of many. Speaking of your father, and I've wondered a number of times after hearing you speak and reading the book, what gave you the courage and the strength to survive what you survived? And I'm thinking of many things, but I'm also thinking of the story that you tell about how your father taught you to fight.
Yes, when he was teaching Zachary, he taught me how to fight, how to do some punching. And actually, my mother urged me to live, but there were two emotions in me. One was love for my people and trying to help them to survive, and then hate for these murderers. I wanted to live long enough to see them pay for their crimes. Not that they paid for their crimes, but at that time, a young girl, I still believed that the war will end and these murderers will pay for their crimes. I wanted to see them defeated. Because I never, they were defeated, but they never paid for their crimes. So these two emotions made me live. But later on, when my mother gave her life for me, I realized that I am a custodian of this very precious life. And if I give up, then she had died in vain protecting me. And so I wanted to keep my promise to my mother and live and try to tell what happened. But you know what the paradox on that, Steve and Tony, is that after the war, nobody really wanted to know what happened. And I said to my mother, thought about my mother and say, Mommy, you were an optimist. But 50 years later, I apologized to my mother. She was right. In order for us to live in a society, in a secure society, we must turn to that page of history, because that page of history was not the total annihilation of the Jewish people, but it was also the dignity of humanity died with them in the camps and in the ghettos. And the young people must know it. It's very important for the children, and they want to know it. This is what's so beautiful about our young generation.
While we're talking about history, I definitely wanted to give you a chance to correct a frequent misimpression, and that is that the Jewish people went meekly into concentration camps. We've already talked a little bit about your brother's activities as a partisan and the courageous things that you've done, but could you tell us some more about how bravely the Jewish people did fight against the occupation?
And what I know about the camps, I know that the people were told that they are going to work camps, to relocating camps. I have learned from the children in my orphanage that they took people into places where they had showers. They gave them soap and towels as though they were going for showers, and bee cycling came out and they died a terrible death. The Germans were masters of deception, and who doesn't want to be deceived, who has a chance maybe in a work camp? Mm-hmm. I have seen this. They could deceive people, build up hope, and then tear them apart to pieces. They did things in the ghetto that people didn't know what happened there. We did not go like sheep to slaughter. That is not true. But I want to explain something to you the way I explain to my wonderful students today. Now, they ask, how is it, Alicia, you were there thousands and there were hundreds of these killers. How come you didn't jump, you didn't revolt, you didn't do something? And I will give you my answer. Can you imagine if we had moved or did anything, what would have happened to the babies and the children if anybody stampeded on them? They would have died a terrible death. So it was like a silent agreement with us that we will give these children a last minute of peace in our arms peacefully. And this is something nobody can tell you because there weren't many who escaped from graves.
Can I ask, I know we've got only about 2 minutes left, but it's right in line with this. There were cases, and you tell a story about, is it Merkel?
Milek.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, my friend Milek, a boy I knew since childhood, he was caught at the graves, and when he saw me going to be machine gunned, he screamed that I should escape, and then he ran up to a German and pulled the machine gun out. I saw him with his crazy arms that jumping up. He started shooting at the Germans, so those who were lined up, we bolted into the forest. I don't know what happened later because I was just running. But he lived through the war, and unfortunately later he stepped on a live mine and he was killed.
I wish we had time for more questions. You are such an incredibly powerful messenger for goodness versus the evil that you experienced in life. But I can tell our viewers who are watching that you've been so gracious to agree to come back and be with us again next week when we'll continue this story. We want to also talk about what happened to you after the war and what you're doing today. And I can say to the viewers, our guest has a most remarkable power with young people, and I wished every young person in the world could hear this story, and many of them have. Ladies and gentlemen, as I've indicated, Alicia Yerman will be back with us next week talking about her book, Alicia, My Story. I hope you'll be with us at that time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
I welcome our viewers back for the second week of our heart-rending story with our guest, and I want to show you her book. Our guest is Alicia Yerman, and I hope many of you have seen this book. If not, we highly recommend it. It's called Alicia, My Story. It is by Bantam Books, and in this very, very important book, our guest tells about the tragedy of her family, how she lost her father and mother and all four brothers during the Holocaust with the Nazis as they invaded Poland where she lived. Many of you, I hope, are back from last week. For you who are not, I'd like to quote from the jacket of the book, which I think is so accurate in describing this very powerful message, when the publisher says, "Not since the Diary of Anne Frank has a young voice so vividly and pointedly expressed the potential for humanity and heroism in the face of Nazi brutality, as does Alicia Appleman Uhrman. In her autobiography, A Young Girl's Story of Courage and Honor in a World Ravaged by War." Alicia, if I may call you that again.
Yes, of course. Please
Welcome
do.
back. You are one of the
Thank
most
you.
remarkable persons I've met. You're extremely kind and filled
I'm
with
very
love.
honored to be back.
And you tell a powerful story, and I hope all of our viewers are going to remember as much as Steve and I. And I welcome Steve back on our panel, the Dean of College and Relations at North Idaho College. And Steve will start today's questioning. We want to pick up with where we left off last time and talk about after the war, what happened to you and the message you have for humanity today. Steve Sheen.
If I can, Alicia, what I want to do to begin with is to explore a sub-theme that I know you're very fond of, and I suppose it's not at all surprising. The book you wrote, Alicia, My Story, it fulfills a promise you made to your dead brother Zachary, who was murdered during the war, and is truly educational. It's your attempt to tell the story of his life and many other lives that were lost in the Holocaust. But you like to talk a lot about education, the value of education to young people, and there's a wonderful story in your book that illustrates how much it meant to you personally. Could you tell us that and then talk a little bit about education?
Thank you, Steve, for asking me that. We Jewish children were not allowed to return to school. And, you know, think about me. I was 11 years old, and these bullies, these soldiers came with guns, machine guns, and declared war on us Jewish children. You cannot have your home, you cannot have your father, you cannot have your family, you can't, and you can't. And something inside me revolted, and I said to myself, I can do one thing. I organized my Jewish friends, and we all entered our classroom and sat in our seats. And when the teacher came in, she kind of got pale in her face, and she pointed out, you, and you have to leave, and you know why. And I loved my teacher. I would never hurt her feelings, but I just had to make that statement to myself. And as we were leaving, I thought there must be some way I could continue learning. You see, I loved learning. We had a tree growing very close to the window of our classroom. The following morning at 6 o'clock, I climbed into that tree, and I sat shivering in the cold leaves until the sun came out. And then at 7:30, the teacher opened the window, and I had a great view. There was the blackboard, there was the teacher, there were my friends. And I was climbing into that tree for a few weeks until one day the teacher put an algebra question on the blackboard. She was looking for a common denominator. I knew the number, and I got so excited. I raised my hand forgetting where I was, and of course I raised the wrong hand, and I came tumbling out of the tree. And there I was sitting in all the glory, a little bit bruised, but mostly my pride was hurt. And the teacher came out, and she looked at me. She says, Alicia, you cannot go in the classroom, and you cannot climb into that tree. So I told her, one day, if I live through the war, I'm going to go to school forever. You know what? I go to school forever. When I enter a classroom, I always sit in the front. And when the teacher calls my name, something inside me lights up with such joy. I am so happy, I'm so grateful, because I know that nobody's going to come up to me and point the finger and say, Alicia, you have to leave because you are Jewish. And I tell my students, whenever I speak, I tell them that the greatest gift that God and our country can give to them is to enter a classroom and say yes when the teacher calls their names.
Thank you.
Something else I want you to share with our teenagers that are viewing the program, and what our hope is that this particular show will be used in classrooms here in the Northwest, and I have never seen anyone that it has more communicative skills than you do with teenagers, and that has to do with the fact that we haven't told our viewers that you were about 13 years old when you were going through this struggle, and your brothers and others lost their lives. It was a time when, like no other, when teenagers had such an incredible responsibility. And would you communicate that story and your love that you have for young people today? You
know, during the war, I was not quite a teenager when we were in the ghetto, because I was only 12 years old. And I saw these beautiful teenagers. They wanted to live so desperately. They were so talented, including my brothers and their friends. And I tried very much to save them. I tried to tell them where to build a hiding place and how to build a hiding place. And this love for the teenagers carried through my whole adult life. And now when I speak to the children, what I want to ask them is, if they have problems, that they should not go face these problems through joining gangs or through drugs or through drink or through anything, that they have strength within themselves to look inside and say, I can face this. I have the strength. And I tell them, you have it in you, just the way we had it. Use it. Because you are a precious human being. Don't destroy yourself through finding all kinds of other ways. And you know what is so beautiful about this generation? Because I educated several generations. They are so sensitive. They write to me. They tell me what is in their hearts. They are sensitive. They are bright. They're brilliant. We must trust these children. We must give them the confidence that they can handle things, and they can. And they are learning from us, from our book, that children can do the impossible. They can be responsible for the welfare of their parents. And this is the message I want to give the children. They have strength within themselves to use in time of need, and I hope they will use this strength to build, and not the way we had to use it.
I want to share with our viewers what I told you before the program. Yesterday, you spoke at our institution, as I said last week on the program, and 1,300 people were there. A lot of them were high school students, and we talked to them afterwards. And so our viewers understand the power of your message. We asked them, what did you get from this speech more than anything else? And the number one answer was, we must never let this happen again. And I just wanted to honor you with that while we're on the air. And I want, before I go back to Steve, say also, it's a time for us to pause to think. Bill Crozier, who teaches at Lake City High School in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, he's responsible for you being here in our town, and he in the Coeur d'Alene School District, and also the Idaho Humanities Council, who helped him with this, and we're grateful to them, and because you have a great message that certainly fits under the category of the humanities also.
And I also want to mention Mr. Bill Crozier. He is really a pioneer, because this is not an easy subject to bring into schools, but he believed in it. He believed that this story is going to greatly benefit the students. And so he went along and did it, and I'm forever grateful, because I could write a good book, but unless the teachers are willing to have the courage and be the guiding angels and guide this book into the students' hearts, this is only then can the story be told and brought to the students.
And yesterday I couldn't believe how many of the students not only had read the book but had it with them, and so
they were wonderful. You know, to me they were like a garden of flowers. I wanted to embrace them and take them to my heart. You have no idea what happens to me when I see these beautiful children come in, and I see here are children with a future. They can build. They are not condemned the way we were. And for a moment there I see the past and the present get together, and I see this anguish of these young children. Then I see these wonderfully radiant faces, and I think, God, I must have done something good that I live to see this wonderful generation with a future.
I hope you will take away from our city with you too the fact that with the message that you shared in your book and your speeches, they will never be subject to the message of hate. They will reject it.
I think, I trust them, I believe in them, because we have wonderful kids. When they say that they will never let it happen again, I believe them. They will not.
Steve Shink.
We talked in the last show about the importance of neighbors. We talked about the fact that part of the tragedy in your life was caused by, not the Germans, but by the Poles and the Ukrainians who betrayed you and other Jews living in that country. It wasn't that way everywhere, though, was it? Tell us a little bit about what happened in Denmark and why you think Denmark was different from Poland.
When the Germans sent to Denmark and they wanted the Jewish people to wear a Star of David, the king put on the Star of David and said, we don't have any Jews here, we have only Danes. And then they saved them. Before the roundup, they saved them, and 99% of them, ones they could find, and brought them over to Sweden. They could, you see, if people wanted to, they could have helped us. But they are an exception, and I will forever be grateful to the Danish people. My people will always be grateful that they have written such a beautiful page in their history. I did not expect all of the other people, all of the other countries in Europe to do the same, but I would have expected them not to collaborate. That was very important, this collaboration, because people could have saved themselves. Many of the partisans would be betrayed in the forest by the native people. And that was very painful, extremely painful. And so I tell the students, I say, your neighbor is somebody who is holding your life in their hands, and so you have to have very good relationships.
I'm going to move, if I can, to a different period. It's the same story, but a different period. So much has been written about the war years, but I think the period just after the war is less well chronicled. And I want you to tell us a little bit about your life after the war was over. Your problems and the problems of the Jewish people in Europe didn't end with the end of the war.
Even after Germany was defeated, we, the survivors, never regained our human rights. The Poles continued killing us. A matter of fact, August the 11th, and you can look it up in the book written by historian Semites and anti-Semites, August the 11th, there was a pogrom in Krakow. I was caught in that pogrom when I was smuggling the Jews out of Poland. I just didn't know it was August the 11th. It was in August.
Pogrom is a term some people may not...
A pogrom is a killing process. In 1946, in Kielce, in the city in Poland, 46 Jewish people were massacred around Passover time. And many of the Jews who returned from Russia were taken off by the Poles from the train and massacred. I know of a man in Canada who was on such a train. He was massacred, machine gunned with all the people, but somebody fell on him and saved his life, so he was just wounded. Now, this is what they did after Hitler was already defeated. Now, how can you stay in a country like that? It was very tragic that this happened. So we had to leave Poland.
And could you tell us a little bit about? I know that much of your life was.
We organized a group called Bricha, and I became one of the smugglers because during the war I saved two groups of Russian partisans, the Kolpak partisans. If anybody is listening, and had been in heard about the Kolpak partisans, and so I saved them on two occasions. And the Russians, the partisans, made me a lieutenant, gave me a medal, made me a Russian hero, and I used these wonderful documents to smuggle the Jews out of Poland. So we could not stay there. We had to smuggle ourselves out, and there were a lot of cases where people were caught and killed after the war. And we had absolutely nowhere to go because in 1947 I was in an orphanage in Belgium, and we were facing another phase because, you see, Israel were the only country who wanted us. It was then Palestine, was under the British dominion, and they did not want to let the refugees in because they didn't want to displease the Arabs who didn't want us in there. And so whenever a ship sailed to go to break the blockade, they were in danger of being blown up or being killed, and I was one of those ships. And I was caught by the British and taken to concentration camp in Cyprus, where I spent 8 miserable months there. 1947, 2 years after the war ended, Jewish children were in camps like that, facing British machine guns. By the way, my book was published in England in hardcover and paperback. This is how it was. They published it because it was the truth.
How frustrating was it for you to have survived the war and still be fighting
I got
for your
an eczema. I was itching and scratching those 8 months. It was terrible for me. To me, I was never in a camp. For me to be in a camp in 1947, and the British were not very kind to us, I can tell you that much.
Let's talk about two things in relation to what you were just talking about. One is you were on this ship that almost got to Israel, and that's when you went to Cyprus. You tell us how difficult that was. I know it was about 21 days, I believe.
Well, we were about 2,600 children. The food was very poor. We were planning on sailing for 5 or 6 days from Marseille to Haifa, but our boat was leaking, so we were hugging the coast, and we sailed and bailed for 21 days. And most of the children were very ill. I don't know why I was feeling well, maybe because of my ancestors coming from Sweden, maybe they were Vikings, who knows. But I did well, and I pulled all these kids out at night. We were manifested as 300 heads of cattle. And we were all these children in this hole, like sardines, like in coffins. But on the 21st day, when I saw these stars, and I thought that this was a beautiful night, but they were the lights of Haifa. And then the kids heard that we arrived in Haifa. Even those who couldn't walk, they crawled out on the deck to see the miracle. But very soon, a plane flew over us, and within half an hour, 3 British frigates surrounded us. And the British captain announced that you are not wanted here, we are going to board you and take you to Cyprus. And our captain says we are children returning from the world of hell, of camps and ghettos, to the home of our ancestors, and you cannot board us. So we children took on the British Navy and fought them for 2 hours. You know what we used for ammunition? Garbage. you threw garbage into their decks, but they got tired, and they threw tear gas, and we started to cough and sneeze. They boarded us, and they took their vengeance because they threw quite a few children into the ocean. They were drowned, rammed the ships. And then I have pictures my captain gave me of coffins taken off my ship of children who were actually clobbered over the head and deadened. And I was on the forefront, and a sailor came to pick me up to throw me overboard. My head fell off, and that split of a second, I took my fist and rammed it in his face and let go of me, and this is how I was able to save myself.
And then your story is so remarkable. So many times you came so close to death, but you survived, and we can see why that this was so crucial and important, that all human beings, as you're advocating to young people to move to their inner self and be determined, and your message is so incredibly powerful. But a very special person in Israel had a role to play in you getting from Cyprus to Israel that later became Prime Minister,
Golda Meir. Yeah, she took 1,000 children out of the camp, and I was one of the 1,000.
And you got to Israel, and then tell us what happened in Israel.
Yeah, when I got to Israel, I walked into another war, because September, I believe, 1947, the United Nations divided Palestine for a Jewish and Arab homeland. The Arabs did not accept this division, and we had to fight for our lives again. And the children who went through hell in Europe had to fight, and they died fighting. Especially near Jerusalem, we had a hill there called Latrun. You see, the Jordanians surrounded Jerusalem, and they wouldn't let any water or food come to the people in Jerusalem. We had to get to them, and to get to them, we had to climb on a hill called Latrun. And these children climbed on that hill and died on that hill. And if I were to speak in their names, I know they gave their lives gladly, as I would have given mine, so the Jewish people have a homeland, and of course, America has a very good friend. But thousands of these children, after the Holocaust, died fighting for their land in Israel.
And then you met someone in Israel, and that,
yeah, and then
that led from there to the United States.
That's right. I met Gabriel Appelman, who came to help us save our lives. We were married in 1950, and in 1952 his father was ill, so we came to the United States. And I was meant to be an American from the very beginning. You know what was so funny? Because when we were leaving, I asked Gabriel, how am I going to fit into your society? After all, I'm a little girl from the village, a little girl from Buchach. He says, Alicia, don't you worry. You are a born Yankee. When they push you against the wall, you hit back. And I never had any problems. I fit in. I always fit in well. Because, you see, I know the history of the people. It is, for me, you know, it's not the refrigerator, the washing machine. It's just the history of people. I always loved the Americans. And after the war in 1945, I met the first American soldiers in Austria. And the way they walked, the world belonged to them. Such free walkers. And I just fell in love the way they walked. They weren't afraid of anybody. The world belonged at that time to the Americans. And I used to stand in the corner and watch them. Of course, they didn't pay any attention to me because they had all these pretty fräuleins they could engage themselves with. I remember once I was following a romance. A jeep with 2 American soldiers were romancing 2 girls on the side. Speaking Fräulein, they were offering them chocolate. And I was just following to see, because I didn't know much about romancing. I was 15 years old, and to me it was just like watching a movie. And then finally they stopped, and the girls finally went into the jeep with the soldiers. And I kept my mouth open, and one of the soldiers says, "Hey, close your mouth, the bird is going to fly in." And Fräulein, he says, I say, "I'm not a Fräulein, I'm a Jewish girl." He says, "Is that so?" But they didn't pay any attention to me. But I just adored just watching them, you know, the way they walked. And that's how I met the first Americans, actually, except for the doctor who cured my pneumonia.
Thank you for telling us that story.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Steve.
We got more to do, but I'm just going back to Steve. I just want to thank you for that story.
And
Steve?
thank you. Oh, we still have more.
Yes.
One of the lighter moments in the book I want you to tell us about is you traveling with a group of younger children to Israel on a ship, and you used your pants as a calendar.
As a calendar,
Would you
right.
tell us that story?
Well, we were in the hall. We didn't know any day from night, and they asked me, "Well, how many days is it already since we sailed?" So I decided to be a calendar. I had long pants, and every day I cut a little piece, and I was moving around, and the kids were touching my legs, and they saw my pants are going shorter. That means we are coming closer to Israel. But after a while, I had short shorts, and I didn't want the boys to touch the calendar. And I said, "Okay, kids, we arrived."
And you met the ship's captain here?
The captain. Oh, Lord, what an... And he heard about this girl who was, taking care of the younger kids, and he wanted to know who I was, and he invited me, wanted to meet me, invited me into the cabin, and I was expecting to see there a captain from Jack London, dressed up in this uniform with gray hair and everything, and there, behind this desk, sits the most gorgeous young man you can possibly imagine, and with my big mouth, always able to communicate, I just opened my mouth and couldn't say a word. Isn't that terrible? And this captain, Mordechai Limon, he sailed our ship, and then he became head of the Israeli Navy. And one day I was going back, because we were stationed on Mount Carmel, and my office, the welfare office, was in the city itself. And we were always getting a ride, and I stopped this little car, and I said, may I have a ride with you to my office? And there opened the nest, and there he was sitting. And he was the head of the Israeli Navy. He had a whole box with pictures, and that's when he gave me the pictures of our ship. And I asked him, what happened to you? He was already at that time engaged, not that he would look at me, but so he explained to me that they had a special hall built for him and the Israeli crew so that the British couldn't find him. So after they took all the refugees off, at night they opened the hall and they were released and they came into Israel. Brave people. And then he wanted to transfer me to his department, but the welfare officer said, no, we need you here to talk to the sailors and to help their families. But I was enchanted by him. His children later married into the Rothschild family.
I want to universalize our discussion just a little bit, and you've talked before about the reason you wrote the book. One is to educate people to what really happened. We talked about how important it is to establish communities of neighbors so it couldn't happen here. I'm just a little bit too young to remember the Second World War, but as I read your book, I was struck by the feeling, could it possibly be true? Could people be this cruel to one another? And yet there's some examples today. Bosnia, some of the things that have gone on there are frighteningly like the actions. You had a term for them, where people are taken out and killed. What could it happen again? And what can we do to stop it?
Okay, the Holocaust happens when the government removes the protection of the law from people. Hitler removed the protection of the law of the Jews, and everybody was right there to kill us. Now, a few years ago, we had something in Los Angeles, burning and killing. This was very much the beginning. The law stood by, didn't do anything. What I tell the children, we have to make sure the people in the government will protect every citizen equally. If we have people like that in the government, we don't have to worry about the Holocaust. Because whatever happens between people, any kind of racial discomfort, this is not going to bring on a Holocaust. It's the government who are supposed to protect every citizen. When they don't protect every citizen, when they let one minority without protection so that other people could kill them, this is how a Holocaust starts. And I tell this to the children over and over again. They are young, it is true, but the soul of the nation is born in the classroom. They have to participate, they have to be aware what's happening, and whoever is in the government must know that he's a servant of the people, of all people. We must not neglect the children. I know in California we have children coming from Mexico who are denied help or medical help. I say, children are innocent. The parents bring them here, and if we can save and serve and help everybody in the world, we certainly can help children who are already here with medical attention, or the mothers or things like that. We must be the custodians of these precious human beings, our children, because they are our legacy, they are our most precious resource. If we don't take care of our children, we don't have a nation.
With that statement, there are constitutional questions that arise, and in our Constitution, we've had a long struggle ourselves, but there's some precious sections of our Constitution that deal with that no person shall be denied equal protection of the laws, and I hear you saying that. And so I'd like for you to continue on this dialogue by indicating that if everyone believes in equality and if we can remove prejudice and bigotry, then I hear you saying a Holocaust cannot take place.
That is right. And children don't know much about hatred. Children learn it from their parents. And why would their parents want to teach hatred to a child? It's the worst thing they can do, them poisoning their little hearts. Why give children literature, hate literature to throw in schools? Because children don't write hate literature, they get it from adults. Why do this kind of disservice? Why use children as a tool of hatred? It is wrong. And I tell the children that they are old enough to understand what is right and what is wrong. And they learn it because children as young as 10 years old are reading my book. They identify very strongly if this is their legacy. And I'm very happy. They asked me to write it. I wrote it because they asked me. And now it's a family book. They celebrate life. Parents, I tell the girls, I say, you know, if you let your mother read the book, for a few days you may even get away without cleaning your room because your mother will be so happy to have you, she won't pay attention on your messy room.
We got to see we're almost out of time, but I don't want to leave this program without our viewers knowing that you have some wonderful children also.
Yes, thank you. We have 2 sons, Daniel and Zachary, and we have a daughter, Ronit, and we have 2 granddaughters. I just have to tell you this little thing about my granddaughter, Maya. Every grandmother likes to talk about their grandchildren. My husband gave Maya a computer game and set her up near the computer, and then he went shopping, and Maya came out and asked her mother, where's Grandpa? And my daughter says, Grandpa went shopping. What is the problem, Maya? Maya says, I have a problem with the game. So Ronnie said, why don't you ask Grandma? And my granddaughter, Maya, says, oh, Mommy, Grandma doesn't know anything about computer games. All she knows is books.
Oh, isn't that a wonderful story?
I only give the children books. For their birthdays, holidays, I give them books and autographed books by authors.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, and most of all, thank you for what you're doing with your work and being with us. And as I introduced the first program, you're a lady of great courage and great love, and we thank you.
May I also have a word? I could not tell my story unless you were willing to receive it into your hearts.
Thank you.
And to you listeners, especially young people, thank you so much, and God bless you.
Bless you. Ladies and gentlemen, please be with us again next week, and we will continue another subject. And thank you for being with us today. Until then, have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.